Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 41, Athens Strikes Back. And so it came to pass that the valiant Greek forces learned the true meaning of friendship, bravely uniting against the cruel barbarian invaders. Through their intense workout routine and manly facial hair, they had succeeded in making the world safe for democracy, spinach pies, and toga parties. Xerxes was defeated, and everyone lived happily ever after. Except when you remove the romanticism and Hollywood hyperbole from the conflict, the truth comes out. Much of Greece capitulated early to avoid destruction, and the Hellenic League was mostly a friendship of convenience. Neutral or turncoat cities would be dealt with in time, but once all the barbarians had been defeated, how long would it take before the old rivalries flared up again, and Greek fought against Greek? But to the uprooted Athenian refugees on Salamis, the more pressing matter was not politics, but simply getting back home. Since Athens was no longer held by the enemy, it was deemed safe to return, and the city was repopulated by its native citizens later in 479 BC. Of course, it wasn't so much a city anymore as it was a smattering of rubble and ruin. Very little was left intact, after withstanding two separate attempts at its total destruction. Houses were torn down, temples sacked and plundered, and the Acropolis was just a hill again. Yet perhaps of most concern was that Athens was without a wall and totally defenseless. Now, most cities in Greece had some kind of fortification protecting its perimeter, and while having one clearly doesn't guarantee safety, it does provide psychological support. Naturally, the first thing the Athenians wanted to do upon their return was to rebuild this wall, but not everyone in Greece is keen to the idea. Corinthian scouts alert their Spartan commanders of this undertaking, and the latter deliver a message to the Athenian citizenry. No need to sweat it out building a wall, guys. Next time there's a problem, just head on back to Salamis. If you really got energy to burn, why not go to the Isthmus of Corinth and fortify that? Trust us on this. Yeah, well, if it sounds suspicious, it's because it is. Sparta wasn't really concerned about the Athenians laboring in the sun. They were more worried about Athenian military power. That fleet of 200 triremes had done much to win the war, and all that power concentrated in one city was making them a bit nervous. At least without a wall, if Athens ever went rogue, for example, they could be neutralized a lot easier. But the Athenians were resolute, and looked for someone to find a way out of this dilemma. Well, who steps up to the plate? Why, the hero of the wars himself, Themistocles. The Athenian statesman in general offers to travel to Sparta to see if he can smooth things out. While most Spartiates didn't have the highest opinion of their Athenian allies, Themistocles was different. His military prowess and bold leadership had done much to earn their respect. Also, the bribes spent on many a Spartan commander, that also went a long way. Themistocles makes it to Sparta, but insists he can't start negotiations until his colleagues arrive, and wouldn't you know it, they were unaccountably delayed. Well, I guess we should call it a night then, huh? I wonder what's for dinner. Of course, there were no colleagues coming. Themistocles was simply stalling for time, and before he left, he gave the Athenians strict instructions. Start building a wall with whatever you can find. Cobblestones, bricks, rocks, even old statues. Just get that wall built high enough to defend the city. So while he was out, the entire city pitched in to get this patchwork wall built lickety-split. Now this endeavor couldn't possibly be kept secret forever, and soon enough word reaches the Spartans, who insist Themistocles explains himself. Ever the politician, he insists that these are preposterous lies, and to prove it, he would stay in Sparta while a delegation is sent to investigate Athens. By the time they arrived, the wall had been finished, and they were held hostage by the Athenians until Themistocles was allowed back home. Politics. The Spartans, irked that the wall had been rebuilt, but without any leverage of their own, insisted that they meant well. The best land defense of Greece really was at the Isthmus of Corinth, but hey, if you guys want to go through the whole burn, sack, loot thing again with your city, who are we to stand in your way? Although there was this momentary lapse in trust, Athens and Sparta still remained as allies, and the following year they joined up again to retake Byzantion, the port city at the entrance of the Black Sea. The allies were successful, but certain events that took place there led to the beginning of the end for one of the war's heroes. The details are murky, but it all centers around the Spartan commander Pausanias. In the last episode, we saw how he and his fellow Spartans withstood overwhelming odds at the Battle of Plataea, and how he had a witty response ready for Persian decadence. Yet something seems to have changed in him. Allied subordinates keep reporting that he's starting to dress in Eastern fashion, and that he's even keeping a personal bodyguard contingent of Medes and Egyptians. He's accused of arrogance and conspiring with the enemy, and finally, after supposedly letting some Persian captives go, Sparta recalls Pausanias back home. Despite his treacherous actions, there wasn't enough evidence to properly indict him, and he's eventually acquitted, but he'd managed to so thoroughly alienate and anger all of his allies that no one wanted a Spartan commander anymore, whereas at the beginning of the war they only wanted one. Athens, sensing opportunity, acted upon it. The Delian League, as it would later be called, would be a coalition of Athens and her friends, primarily the Ionian cities and many Aegean islands. The name comes from Delos, the island where in 477 representatives met to swear an oath to protect each other and to fight the Persians wherever they may be. As each member joined this Hellenic Justice League, they cast heavy lumps of iron into the ocean, swearing that the alliance would last until the iron floated on the waves. The structure of the club was a little different than Sparta's Peloponnesian League, which pretty much existed to support Sparta and to keep the Helots down. The rules of the Delian League were simple. Every year, member cities were required to make payments of ships or gold to combat the Persian Empire. Some of the larger islands like Naxos and Samos were able to supply ships, but most members gave gold, which would be kept on Delos as well. Athens always supplied ships, and was the only member to have access to the treasury. So this should give you a good idea who was really in command of the whole thing. The Delian League really first tested its naval power under the Athenian commander Cimon, who, if you recall, was the son of Miltiades, the disgraced Athenian hero of Marathon, who was fined an absurd amount of money and couldn't possibly pay it off. Cimon led the league to numerous victories over the Persians in the Aegean, conquering islands held by them, winning over allies in Thrace, fighting pirates, and even discovering the bones of Theseus on the island of Skyros. Some of these new allies came willingly, others became Athenian-held territory, not quite colony, not quite enslaved. But as Athens used the League to spread her influence and gain power, some wondered if perhaps it was all a bit much. The first member to question the direction Athens was taking the League was Naxos, and around 470 they decided to forget about paying their dues and quit. Unfortunately, the Naxians failed to estimate how seriously the Athenians took the whole floating iron metaphor, and in retaliation Athens attacked the island, blockading it and then seizing its fleet. A permanent guard of Athenian hoplites would stand guard over the island, ensuring that Naxos would continue to pay gold even though not in the League anymore. A powerful and controversial move. Athens was occupying a Greek island. Now before we move on, we need to wrap up the stories of our two military heroes, Pausanias and Themistocles. The former was in a PR death spiral, coming out innocent from his trial, but marred by accusations of Persian sympathy. He was sent back to Byzantium to rejoin the Greek front lines, but again came the allegations, only this time there was evidence. A former lover of his had intercepted a letter bound for Xerxes, supposedly detailing how Sparta could be brought over to the Persians, and delivered it to the Spartan leaders. This was the final nail in the coffin, and without knowing why, Pausanias is recalled back to Sparta again. Except that before he could be apprehended, a friend tips him off and he makes a beeline to the Temple of Athena, where he seeks sanctuary. It's considered bad juju to cause violence within a sacred place, so the Spartans couldn't simply drag him out. But that didn't stop them from having their way either. Enraged at his treachery, they walled up the only way in and out of the temple, leaving their former commander and regent to the throne to starve, alone and disgraced within the temple walls. Justice was sort of done. But the story's not over yet, because Spartan leaders sent word to their Athenian counterparts that evidence existed implicating Themistocles as a collaborator. Ever since the wars wrapped up, Themistocles' popularity had been on the wane. Sure, he had saved the Athenians and pretty much all of Greece by using Salamis as a last stand, not to mention organizing the Delian League, fighting for the Ionian city's freedom, and that whole business with the wall. But we all know how Athens treats her heroes, the way Gotham City does. And since Themistocles had grown more powerful, financially and politically, people suspected his ambitions, and were biding their time for the right moment to get him. That moment came around 472, when he summoned to Athens to answer for these accusations of treachery. Sensing that enemies were everywhere and fearing an unfair trial, he flees to Argos, a city which had no love for either Sparta or Athens. A year later, he is formally ostracized, but it didn't matter. Themistocles had already sailed on over to Persia, where despite the bounty on his head, he used his gift of gab to convince the new king, Artaxerxes, to grant him sanctuary. Former enemies became friends, and Themistocles became satrap of Magnesia, a city in western Asia Minor, where he lived out the rest of his life. Was he really guilty of betraying his countrymen? No, definitely not. But he had ticked off the wrong people. Perhaps the Spartans, angered at his trickery with the wall, trumped up the evidence, and the Athenians played right into it. We'll never know. But without Themistocles in the spotlight, a new political celebrity had emerged in the restored Athens. Cimon. Sure, he's not as charismatic as Themistocles, or as clever with his words, but as a member of the conservative base, he is well ingrained into the old boys club, making him a safe political bet. He's also well liked in Sparta. Having a son named Lacedaemonius is bound to do that. And best of all about Cimon is that his sister is even more well-liked than him. Elpenike, intelligent, charming, respected for both her political mind as well as her social graces, a rare feat in a male-dominated society. Elpenike had already saved the family's name and debt problem by agreeing to marry the wealthiest man in Athens, and this man would later negotiate a truce with the Persians, thus at least temporarily ending hostilities. The early 460s saw Athens regain her lost footing in the Greek world. The coffers overflowed with Persian treasure, Athenian triremes spread far into the Mediterranean, and the city was being rebuilt as fast as they could. And then, in 464, the good times came to a halt. While the Athenians were overseas putting down another Delian League resistor, a massive earthquake struck Sparta, leveling homes and tearing through the countryside. When the tremors had passed, thousands were dead, and entire towns were destroyed. And this was only the beginning of Sparta's worst nightmare, because in the chaos following the disaster, the Helots rebelled, the largest insurrection to date. For nearly 2 years, the Spartans struggled to put down this massive uprising, unable to remove their former slaves from Mount Ithome, where they had hunkered down. Finally, they swallowed their pride and asked the Athenians for support. Cimon was all for it, as were many from the aristocratic classes who enjoyed the peace and cooperation with Sparta in the years following the Persian Wars. Yet Cimon still had to make his case to those who saw no need to send aid. Will you look on and see Hellas lamed, and Athens without her yokefellow? Cimon asked his countrymen, appealing to the Hellenic camaraderie that carried them to victory not too long ago. He got his vote, and later that year in 462, Cimon led 4,000 Athenian hoplites off to Sparta to help crush the rebellion. But it didn't quite work out the way he expected. When they arrived at the scene, the Spartans grew increasingly nervous, then agitated at, and I quote, "the daring and revolutionary spirit of the Athenians, and felt that if they stayed, they might be persuaded by the defenders of Ithome to change sides." What was making the Spartans so uncomfortable? One word: Democrats. Remember that back in the ancient world, only the wealthiest citizens could afford hoplite armor, so we're still talking about the aristocracy here. But there's a new political movement sweeping through Athens, and it advocates concern for the lower classes, voting privileges for all men, shattering the status quo, Athenian independence, and most of all, no Sparta. In fact, Ephialtes, the leader of the Democrats, responded to Cimon's pleas by saying, "Let Sparta's pride be trampled underfoot." It's no surprise the Spartans sent them home, or else they might have had to face a combined Helot-Athenian army. So back to Athens the hoplites went, grumbling along the way, Cimon no doubt humiliated. But if he expected to be treated lightly when he returned, he was wrong. In his absence, Ephialtes and his associate Pericles successfully passed an act depriving the Areopagus, that's the landed elite, of much of their power, and opened up much more political authority to the lower bodies. They even formed an alliance with Argos, Sparta's traditional enemy, just to really drive the point home that the old ways are out of here. But they weren't done yet, as to really rub it in Cimon's face, they successfully ostracized him. The once, and still popular leader, was legally banned from Athens for 10 years. The door was now wide open for a bright new age of democratic reforms, except later that year in 461, Ephialtes is struck down by an assassin's blade. The culprit is never identified, although presumably it was someone angered at the pace with which the pendulum was shifting. Perhaps someone with close ties to Cimon? Nevertheless, if they thought that by extinguishing the leading voice of the Democrats that would silence the rest of them, they were sorely mistaken. Stepping up to fill Ephialtes' shoes was his young protege, the 33-year-old Pericles, a man who would rise to become leading citizen of Athens and eventually her greatest leader. In the next episode, we'll explore the Golden Age of Athens, which should give you a hint as to what kind of leader he was. We're looking at a time marked by expansion, glory, and finally building something nice on that Acropolis. But like always, just because it's a good time to be an Athenian doesn't mean the good times will last, as Athens' yokefellow is cautiously watching from the south, unsure as to what this new radical democracy means for them. The Helot uprising has been crushed, but could a more dangerous enemy be just around the corner? That's all next time on the podcast history of our world.